Hello again, and welcome to a lecture, a very brief lecture, I hope, on dialogue. And the reason why it's going to be brief is because there is actually tons of super useful lectures on dialogue that I think are far more concise and useful than I could ever be. And so for that reason, I just want to run through some of the important things about dialogue that relate to how I'm grading your posts. And then I want you to spend most of your time this unit looking at the other three YouTube tutorials that I've linked. So dialogue is especially important to me. I believe dialogue can really create a story and can sustain a story and can create a play and sustain a play. The reason why dialogue is so important is it can show mostly everything we want to show in a story or a play. So it can show conflict, as in two characters are talking, and through their conversation, we understand what both of the characters want and are unable to obtain. Dialogue is a way to show character, as in we understand character's voice, or we understand character's conflict, or we understand character's um, actions. Dialogue is also a way to show setting. So, how a character talks can tell us when we are, where we are, how characters sort of interact with the world around them can be told through dialogue. If you think of a play that takes place in a restaurant, dialogue can sort of show us where we are. The one of the characters places their order, or a character talks about the food that they're eating. Dialogue is also a way to ensure there is change happening. Every time a character sort of reveals something to another character, the story is changing, things are moving forward. However, even though dialogue is so important, it is very, very easy to have bad dialogue. And I think it has something to do with the way we're taught, maybe to write, is to just sort of go out and listen to people talk. And that is what dialogue is in short stories. And in fact, in real life, I mean, I'm not judging your life, but at least in my life, I have very boring conversations. There's a lot of ums and uhs, and there's a lot of small talk that doesn't really move anything forward. And so, for that reason, dialogue is a little bit more complicated than just mimicking real world conversations. Um, Dialogue, and so I'll get to that a little bit later. Dialogue is a fundamental unit in playwriting because if you remember, well, actually, you'll learn. Um, Aside from dialogue, you have the stage in plays. So it's really important that you understand how dialogue functions. Otherwise, it's very possible that you won't have an effective play. It's also important in short stories, as for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Just so that we're all on the same page, dialogue is the conversations between characters in your story or your play. It's a way for you to let the reader into the world that you've created. Good dialogue moves the action of your story or your play forward. It reveals characters and it has subtext. Now, subtext is something that you'll learn a lot about in another YouTube video, again, that I've linked. But just like a quick run through, some subtext is what's underneath the written or the spoken word. So, if you have two characters and one character says, I'm doing fine, but as she's saying, I'm doing fine, there's a tear coming down her face, and you know from earlier pages that she just found out that she is going to have to repeat the 12th grade. The subtext of her I'm doing fine is that she's not actually doing fine. So the idea here is that good dialogue needs to have something underneath what's being said. You don't want to have dialogue in which everything that needs to be said is said, because then there's no conflict. In other words, you have two characters in a relationship. One character says, I'm not happy. The other character says, I'm not happy either. Why are you not happy? And they have a very healthy conversation in which they're saying exactly what they're thinking. That's really great for real life, but for storytelling, it's not useful. You want to have layers of meaning that are hidden beneath what's said. The idea is characters aren't super forthcoming. They do hide sometimes what they're feeling, or they're unable to say how they're feeling. So, how do we build good dialogue? I have a couple of tips. Again, the other YouTube links will provide more tools. One method of building good dialogue is to have your characters misunderstand each other. So, an example I have here is a character says, "Don't tell me how to speak to my own son's teacher." Then someone says, "Then stop acting so wild whenever." And then the same character says, "So now I'm a monster, a wild creature you can't tame." So what's happening here is this character is misunderstanding what this other person is saying. The reason why they're misunderstanding what this character is saying is because clearly they're either dealing with their own stuff, or they're projecting, or they already are mad at this person and so want to pick a fight, right? That's a way to build good dialogue, to have characters misunderstand each other and sort of get to why they're misunderstanding each other as the story or the play progresses. Another way that you can build effective dialogue is to have two characters in a room. One character desperately wants to tell the other character some sort of secret, but can't, either because they are telling this other person the secret and this other person is just not understanding, or they are trying to say the secret but don't want to say it directly, and so the other character is just not catching on because it's so indirect. Um, or they're trying to give this secret away or tell this secret to another character, but they don't want to actually tell it. They want this other character to guess it on their own, right? And this sounds very like, how would that ever work in a story? But in fact, it's pretty much the basis of like 75% of the dialogue scenes that we read. So, you might have a character two best friends, one friend knows that the other friend's boyfriend is cheating on her. She wants desperately to tell her that this is happening, but she can't. And so she just keeps asking, have you spoken to him? I heard that he was going to this party. Don't you think it's weird that he's going to this party when he said to you he's not? And so that's an example of fishing, right? This character keeps trying to get this other person to understand what's going on. And then maybe the whole conflict is eventually this person just has to say it directly because clearly their friend is not getting the hint. Another kind of way to develop good dialogue is through avoidance. So you have two characters that are talking about something that doesn't really get at the real issue. They're actually trying to avoid the real issue. So for example, characters who are focusing on the color of wallpaper when really they're avoiding talking about the fact that one cheated on another. We have Aaron and Jacob. Aaron says, I really like this shade of gray. Jacob says, I'm not sure about this color of gray. Aaron says, you never agree on anything that I pick. Jacob says, I do, I just don't know about this gray. And then they proceed to talk about what's wrong with this gray. And then finally we realize that gray is actually a metaphor for some larger issue that they're trying not to deal with. Again, a method for developing effective dialogue. And I hope you're noticing that these methods are useful because they also ensure that your dialogue has subtext. Ineffective dialogue, then, is dialogue that is just bickering. Two characters who are just telling each other how much they dislike each other, or they're just bickering, but nothing's moving forward. The characters aren't changing. The plot isn't changing. It just feels like we're stuck. And again, this does happen in real life, but in storytelling, not super effective. Another ineffective way to use dialogue is if you're just telling the reader or the audience about the characters or about the story instead of showing us what's going on. So you have a character who says, I'm going to school. I have been going to school for 4 years. That seems like it's a clever way to tell us backstory, but in fact, it's clearly you just telling us backstory. And then the other thing is there's no subtext there, and so it becomes flat, ineffective dialogue. And I mentioned this before, dialogue is not about being realistic or mimicking real life conversations. And I do have this example here that I'd like to share with you very quickly.
Hi.
Can I help you?
Yeah, can I have a dozen red roses, please?
Oh, hi, Johnny. I didn't know it was you. Here you go.
That's me. How much is it?
It'll be $18.
Here you go. Keep the change. Hi, doggy.
You're my favorite customer.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And so you'll see there that, well, I hope you saw that it's mimicking real life conversation and that it's like small talk, it's awkward. But for an actual movie, it doesn't work because it feels like we are witnessing something that is totally flat, has no purpose. And if you are familiar with the overall movie, The Room, you'll realize that that whole scene, we never return back to it. We have no idea what the significance is of the florist. Nothing's moved forward from that scene, and so it's ineffective. The other thing that I want you to think about with dialogue is how dialogue can really work to be a power exchange. Maybe this is clearer in Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants. Every time the two characters exchange dialogue, one holds the power and one is trying to get the power. And so when I say that, how do you understand whether a character has power or not? It's how they talk to the other person. So look at these different ways of saying the same thing. Do you think I could have that water? Can I have that water? Give me the water. Get me water now. So in the first instance, we have a character who clearly doesn't feel like they have any power. The second instance, maybe a little more. The third, definitely they feel like they have the power. And the fourth, they have all the power. And so in thinking about dialogue, how can you show in your scenes two characters who are constantly shifting in power dynamics? In one line of dialogue, they have the power, and then in the next line, they lose it and are trying to get it back. If you can figure out a way to keep this power exchange going, you are almost guaranteed to have effective dialogue that is pushing plot forward because there's constantly changes, the change being who has the power. And then finally, another way to think of dialogue is as a reveal. In my face-to-face creative writing class, what I do is I have two students stand in the opposite ends of the classroom, and they are characters in a play, and each of them has to create a line of dialogue. They're only able to move closer to one another if something is revealed through their line of dialogue. And what happens is often in the beginning, they're saying things that doesn't actually change anything. The characters don't learn anything new. nothing's moving forward. And so they might stay at opposite ends of the room, but then as they think about like character change and the things that we've talked about, they start to, create lines of dialogue that are surprising, that show something new, that challenge the character across from them. And by the end, the goal is to have the two characters be almost nose to nose. And so that's another way to think about how to develop your own dialogue. Imagine these two characters on stage starting at opposite ends, but through dialogue, after every reveal or after every line in which a character sheds or shares something about themselves that the other character doesn't know, these two people get closer and closer and closer until they're nose to nose. And perhaps that's the moment when the true conflict is revealed, or perhaps that's the moment where there's a climax in which something has to give. But that's how I think, I feel like that's a useful way to visualize effective dialogue. And again, please keep watching the other lectures that I've linked on dialogue. It will be very helpful. Also, it will prevent you from getting feedback from me that really you probably wouldn't need if you just watch the videos. And I'm talking from experience. The one thing often that creative writing students don't really grasp the first time around is the importance of subtext. So I do recommend that you watch that subtext video once or twice before writing your dialogue. And I will see you soon.